On the night of March 8, 2014, under a calm Malaysian sky where the air was still and the world moved in its usual rhythm, Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 began what was supposed to be a routine red-eye journey from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing, carrying 227 passengers and 12 crew members, ordinary families, students, business travelers, children asleep in their seats, unaware that within hours, their flight would become the greatest unsolved aviation mystery of the 21st century. A disappearance so complete, so sudden, and so impossible that it would challenge radar systems, expose global blind spots, humiliate powerful nations, and ignite a decade-long obsession that still grips the world. At 12:41 a.m., MH370 lifted off smoothly, climbing through the night sky as the pilots contacted Malaysian Air Traffic Control and settled into their flight path, while passengers relaxed, some drifting into sleep, some watching movies, not knowing that after only 39 minutes of calm cruising, the aircraft would suddenly vanish from civilian radar, disappearing as if pulled into another dimension, beginning a chain of events that no investigation, no satellite, no Navy, and no government has ever fully explained. At 1:19 a.m., as the plane approached the boundary between Malaysian and Vietnamese airspace, the captain's final words were transmitted. "Good night, Malaysian 370." A phrase so ordinary, so routine, that no one listening could have imagined it was the final, confirmed human communication from the aircraft. Just 2 minutes later, the transponder, the electronic heartbeat of a commercial jet, went dark. The communication systems powered off, and MH370 made a mysterious, sharp turn west, drifting off its assigned route in total silence, moving like a ghost aircraft through the night. Military radar later revealed what civilian radar could not. MH370 turned back across Malaysia, flew over Penang, skimmed the border of the Strait of Malacca, and headed northwest, not toward Beijing, but toward the Indian Ocean, all without a single distress call, without any attempt to re-establish radio contact, without any sign of trouble from the cabin, raising one terrifying question: who was in control of Flight 370? As hours passed and families waited at Beijing Airport, expecting their loved ones to walk through the arrival gates, confusion spread, officials stalled, and the first whispers of fear swept across the terminal. No one knew where the plane was. Malaysia Airlines announced the flight was missing. Nations scrambled jets, naval forces deployed, satellites were redirected, and the South China Sea became the center of a desperate search. But MH370 was not there. In fact, no one knew that the aircraft had already left that region entirely. Behind the scenes, investigators discovered something even stranger. The plane continued flying for nearly 7 more hours after disappearing from radar, its engines handshaking, with a satellite at 2:25 a.m., 3:41 a.m., 4:41 a.m., 5:41 a.m., 6:41 a.m., and then the final handshake at 8:19 a.m. This meant the aircraft was airborne long after the world believed it had crashed. But where it went remains one of the greatest puzzles in aviation history. The Inmarsat satellite data later revealed 2 possible arcs: a northern corridor stretching toward Central Asia, and a southern corridor plunging deep into the Indian Ocean. But only one matched the physics. The southern path, a vast expanse of water so remote, so deep, and so void of radar coverage that a Boeing 777 could simply vanish forever. This revelation forced investigators to confront the horrifying possibility that MH370 had not suffered an accidental catastrophic failure, because no failure would disable communications, yet allow 7 more hours of flight, but rather that something deliberate, something controlled, something chillingly intentional may have occurred. Meanwhile, families at Kuala Lumpur and Beijing watched helplessly as governments contradicted each other. Search areas shifted, clues emerged and collapsed, and hope mutated into confusion. Rumors exploded across the world: terrorism, hijacking, cockpit intrusion, fire, decompression, stowaways, intelligence operations gone wrong. But none explained the deliberate path changes, the silence, the 7 hours of ghost flight, the missing ELT beacon, and the lack of floating debris. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the Indian Ocean swallowed the truth, hiding MH370 beneath its crushing depths, while nations launched the largest, most expensive search in aviation history, covering 120,000 square kilometers of ocean floor, but finding nothing. Not a single seat, wing section, fuselage piece, or life vest. Technology failed, sonar failed, satellites failed. MH370 had entered a place beyond human reach. But then, in 2015, a barnacle-encrusted flaperon washed ashore on Réunion Island, the first confirmed piece of MH370 wreckage, proving the plane had indeed ended in the Indian Ocean. More debris washed up: wing sections, cabin interior fragments, engine cowling pieces, showing burn marks, brake patterns, and strange hydrodynamic damage that sparked even more questions rather than answers. Why was debris scattered across so many coastlines? What does the brake pattern say about the final moments? Did the plane glide, crash intact, or dive vertically? Who, if anyone, was conscious during the final hours? Did anyone try to save the aircraft? Or had it been on autopilot until fuel starvation ended the flight? As the world searched for truth, journalists, investigators, pilots, and intelligence analysts uncovered disturbing anomalies in the official timeline, gaps in radar data, contradictory statements from authorities, and evidence withheld for weeks, fueling suspicion and making MH370 not just an accident, but a labyrinth of secrets. Governments blamed each other. Agencies avoided responsibility, and the black boxes, the only real proof, remained on the ocean floor, buried deeper than Titanic, deeper than sonar can confidently map, making recovery nearly impossible. And as theories multiplied, from rogue pilot action to cockpit intrusion, decompression, electrical fire, hijacking, remote cyber interference, or even covert military involvement, one truth stood undeniable: MH370 did not disappear by accident. Something happened aboard that aircraft that no one has fully explained, and someone, somewhere, may know more than they have ever revealed. As MH370 slipped silently away from the edge of Vietnamese airspace and veered off its scheduled course into the darkness, the aircraft transformed from a routine passenger jet into a phantom crossing the skies, a machine stripped of communication yet moving with deliberate precision. And the world below remained unaware that a new chapter in aviation mystery was unfolding, because when the transponder blinked out at 1:21 a.m., it marked the beginning of a sequence of events that would challenge every assumption investigators held about how a modern aircraft could vanish. Radar showed the plane making a sharp left turn, known as the intercept turn, a maneuver not caused by malfunction, but by deliberate control, guiding MH370 back across the Malay Peninsula toward Penang, the home region of Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, a detail that would later ignite controversy, suspicion, and debates that still rage today. For how could an aircraft suffering catastrophic failure continue making controlled turns, altitude changes, and navigational decisions for nearly an hour without radio communication, without distress calls, and without any attempt to restore contact? As the aircraft flew toward Penang, it dipped to a lower altitude, potentially low enough to evade certain radar detection, passing over the island as if offering a final silent farewell, a fly-past gesture that investigators, psychologists, and aviation experts interpreted as intentional and personal, though no one could definitively prove its meaning. From there, MH370 continued northwest, hugging the border of Malaysian and Thai airspace, a route so precisely chosen that each nation's radar system would assume the aircraft was being monitored by the other, a path only an experienced pilot might choose if attempting to avoid interception or detection. And the longer the aircraft flew, the more the mystery deepened. Why no emergency call? Why no transponder reset? Why no struggle evident in cabin audio logs? And, most hauntingly, why did no passenger attempt to use a mobile phone despite the aircraft flying over populated landmasses during the return path? Hours later, long after the world thought the flight had crashed somewhere in the South China Sea, the truth emerged that MH370 was still flying, still alive in the air, still communicating with a satellite in a primitive but detectable digital heartbeat, a series of pings sent automatically every hour between the plane's SATCOM system and the Inmarsat satellite orbiting above the Indian Ocean. And these pings, called handshakes, became the only thread investigators had to reconstruct the aircraft's path. A ghost trail without GPS, without altitude data, without speed readings, only mathematical reconstructions based on Doppler shifts, timing offsets, and complex modeling that required months of computation to understand. Yet those faint signals told a chilling story. MH370 crossed the South Andaman Sea before turning south into the most remote ocean corridor on Earth, a stretch of water so empty and so deep that even submarines avoid it, a place where no radar exists and where no accidental flight would ever wander, raising another agonizing question. Why fly to the end of the world unless it was intentional? Meanwhile, in Kuala Lumpur and Beijing, families sat in growing horror as Malaysian officials contradicted themselves, releasing incomplete data, withholding radar logs, and miscommunicating search areas. While news networks around the world broadcast conflicting reports, turning the tragedy into chaos, and every passing hour without wreckage only strengthened suspicions that the truth was being concealed, either through incompetence or deliberate withholding. Back in the skies, somewhere near 2:40 a.m., MH370 crossed the last known military radar point near the Andaman Sea, after which the aircraft entered what became known as the Seventh Arc, a final satellite ping at 8:19 a.m., nearly 7 hours after the plane left Malaysian airspace, indicating that the plane continued straight until fuel starvation caused both engines to flame out, leading the aircraft into its last moments. But even those last moments remain shrouded in mystery. Did the aircraft glide? Did it spiral? Did it crash nose first in a near-vertical descent? Or was someone still at the controls guiding it to a soft water ditching meant to minimize debris? Each scenario told a different version of what might have happened inside the cockpit. A deliberate pilot suicide? A hijacking gone wrong? A catastrophic decompression leaving everyone unconscious? Or even a sudden electrical fire eliminating communications but leaving autopilot running? Yet none of these theories perfectly fit the known facts. The deeper investigations went, the stranger the anomaly list grew. The ACARS system shut off exactly when the transponder went dark. The flight management computer was likely reprogrammed. The cabin pressurization theory conflicted with the recorded flight duration. The possibility of a cockpit intrusion clashed with lack of distress signals, and the idea of a purely accidental electrical failure collapsed under the weight of the plane's deliberate navigation choices. Even the passenger's mobile silence raised eyebrows. No calls, no texts, no signals, leading experts to consider whether the cabin might have been depressurized early in the flight, leaving everyone unconscious while the plane flew on autopilot until fuel depletion. Though this theory, too, met resistance because it did not explain the tactical route choices. As search teams from 26 countries spread across Asia, the Indian Ocean, and the Andaman Sea, ships from China, Australia, the U.S., and Malaysia scanned millions of square kilometers. Sonar drones descended into the blackness, satellites were retasked from military duties, and still nothing. No oil slick, no floating luggage, no bodies, no clear debris field, appeared in the early months, plunging the world into disbelief that a Boeing 777, one of the safest, strongest, and most trackable aircraft ever built, could simply vanish without a trace. And in that vacuum of information, conspiracy theories exploded. U.S. military shootdown near Diego Garcia, cyber hijacking through onboard systems, a clandestine intelligence operation, Russian involvement during the Crimea crisis, or even supernatural speculation, none proven, all fueled by the sheer impossibility of the disappearance. Governments released partial data, withheld other parts, and provided inconsistent timelines that made families suspect a cover-up, especially when Malaysian authorities admitted the plane had been on military radar for over an hour, without interception, and when Vietnam claimed it never received expected communication from Malaysian controllers, creating a chain of diplomatic embarrassment that no nation involved wanted to fully explain publicly. Meanwhile, aviation experts across the world were forced to confront an unsettling realization. Modern air travel, despite all its technology, had vast blind spots, regions where a plane could disappear completely for hours without detection, oceans with sonar-resistant depths, satellites with insufficient coverage, and radar systems full of political limitations. As the investigation into Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 deepened, the disappearance of the aircraft evolved from a tragedy into a labyrinth so complex, so contradictory, and so drenched in secrecy that every new discovery only raised more questions, and every unanswered detail began spinning into a web of theories, some grounded in forensic science, some rooted in psychology, and others born from the sheer desperation of families and investigators who could not accept that a 299-ton Boeing 777 could simply dissolve into the Indian Ocean without leaving a trace. And while governments insisted the truth was buried beneath miles of water, the world could not ignore the glaring inconsistencies surrounding the flight's final hours, starting with the most controversial element of all, the pilots. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, a respected veteran with over 18,000 flight hours, a man known for calm professionalism, suddenly became the unwilling center of global suspicion when investigators discovered a flight simulator inside his home, on which a route astonishingly similar to MH370's final suspected path had been practiced. A long flight into the Indian Ocean ending in fuel exhaustion. A detail leaked months later, only because foreign investigators pressured Malaysia into releasing it. And this revelation shook the world as experts debated whether the simulation represented a deliberate plan, a technical experiment, or merely a coincidence dredged from thousands of saved paths. Yet despite the simulator findings, Zahari had no financial problems, no medical disorders, no extremist behavior, no psychological deterioration, and no known motive, while his friends and colleagues described him as gentle, sociable, and deeply dedicated to his family, leaving investigators torn between cold data and human character. Meanwhile, attention shifted to the first officer, Farik Abdul Hamid, a young co-pilot finishing his training on the 777, whose phone mysteriously connected briefly to a cell tower while the aircraft crossed Penang, raising questions about whether he attempted a secret call. Yet Malaysian authorities dismissed the event as normal phone background behavior, an explanation that satisfied no one, and so suspicion swung outward again, toward the cabin itself, where two passengers boarded with stolen passports, sparking fears of terrorism, until Interpol revealed they were simply Iranian migrants, attempting illegal travel, unrelated to any extremist plot. With terrorism ruled out and no hijacker claims emerging, investigators turned toward the mechanical failure theories, but none stood against the evidence. Catastrophic decompression could not explain the deliberate route changes. An electrical fire could not selectively disable communications while preserving flight control for 7 hours. Fuel leak theories collapsed under timing inconsistencies, and pilot incapacitation scenarios clashed with the plane's navigational precision, leaving only one possibility that matched the radar path. Someone deliberately flew MH370 into a region where it would never be found. But even this theory faltered in the face of new anomalies, especially the complete lack of debris during the early search. Not one floating seat, suitcase, or life vest appeared where models predicted, leaving experts puzzled because even controlled ditchings produce floating debris. Then, when debris finally washed ashore, the flaperon from Réunion Island, several wing parts from Mozambique and Madagascar, cabin pieces from Tanzania. Forensic experts discovered unusual brake patterns, suggesting that the aircraft did not explode in mid-air, but instead hit the water in a relatively intact state, a finding that contradicted violent decompression theories and nudged investigators closer to the idea of a controlled, low-speed water impact executed by someone conscious during the final descent, a possibility too uncomfortable for many governments to admit publicly. And still, the mystery deepened. Burn marks on debris hinted at possible electrical fire or high heat event, yet not enough to explain the total communication loss. Marine organisms growing on the flaperon suggested it had floated for months before reaching land, providing clues to its drift path. Yet currents of the Indian Ocean were so chaotic, researchers could not reverse track it accurately. Satellite burst frequency offset analysis indicated the plane descended rapidly in its last moments. Yet additional fuel flow modeling suggested autopilot might have disengaged earlier, allowing the aircraft to spiral, leaving two entirely different final moment scenarios, each backed by strong technical arguments. At the same time, geopolitical theories surged when independent analysts uncovered radar gaps over the Andaman Sea, Indian military silence about their radar coverage that night, and conflicting statements from Thai and Malaysian air defense officials that ignited suspicion that some nations knew more about MH370's path than they were willing to reveal. Meanwhile, U.S. intelligence involvement at Diego Garcia, a heavily protected naval base, became a central conspiracy thread, fueled not by evidence, but by the extraordinary secrecy surrounding military radars in the region. China, with 152 nationals aboard, publicly demanded answers while quietly withholding its own satellite data. And even Australia, which led the ocean floor search, expressed frustration at Malaysia's slow, inconsistent, and often contradictory information flow, leading journalists to question whether MH370's disappearance had accidentally intersected with classified military operations or triggered diplomatic sensitivities that forced nations to hide radar capabilities. The more investigators dug, the more it became clear that MH370 was not only a tragedy, it was a political nightmare. But while governments argued, private experts pursued alternative paths. Some focused on passenger cargo, including a mysterious load of lithium batteries known to cause fires, though this failed to explain the 7-hour flight. Others highlighted the plane's SATCOM reboot at 2:25 a.m., which suggested someone manually restored power, an action no mechanical failure would perform on its own. Still others examined the possibility of crew hypoxia caused by gradual decompression, but this could not account for the aircraft's precise maneuvers early in the diversion. Meanwhile, families of the victims, exhausted by contradictions, accused Malaysia Airlines and government officials of incompetence, obfuscation, and slow reaction. Claims supported when transcripts revealed a 4-hour delay before declaring the plane missing, giving MH370 time to travel thousands of kilometers unnoticed. International investigators eventually concluded that MH370 likely ended somewhere along the remote 7th arc. But the exact point remained elusive because satellite timing data provided only distance, not direction, and underwater search areas, as large as entire countries, yielded no wreckage. Even when advanced search drones scanned the ocean floor, mapping underwater mountains and trenches never charted before, the plane remained hidden, leaving experts baffled at how such a massive aircraft could evade the world's most advanced search equipment. And so, as Part 3 closes, the truth stands naked and unsolved. MH370 is not one mystery. It is 100 mysteries woven together, each contradicting the next, each exposing human vulnerability, technological blind spots, and geopolitical shadows. And with every theory failing to explain every clue, one terrifying possibility remains. That MH370's disappearance was not the result of a single failure, but a cascade of events so perfectly aligned, so unprecedented, that even a decade later, the world is no closer to understanding exactly what happened inside that cockpit, inside that cabin, and inside those final minutes when a flight crossing a peaceful night sky slipped beyond the reach of every radar, every satellite, and every nation, becoming the most haunting aviation mystery of the modern world. As the final hours of Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 unfolded, somewhere above the desolate stretch of the southern Indian Ocean, where the sky meets a horizon so empty it feels like the edge of the world, the aircraft continued its lonely voyage without radio communication, without transponder signals, and without a single human voice breaking the silence, moving deeper and deeper into a region where no radar scans, no ships patrol, and no nation watches, a place so remote that even satellites barely graze its surface. And as the world slept unaware of the tragedy, drifting unnoticed through the darkness, the aircraft traced a final, haunting arc across the black ocean, its engines faithfully pushing forward until fuel starvation crept silently through its turbines. An ending that investigators would later reconstruct from faint satellite pings, but could never fully understand. For what truly happened inside the cockpit during those final moments remains locked in a silence as deep as the ocean floor itself. And the question that haunts every expert is not how the aircraft flew so far, but why it flew there at all. Whether Captain Zahari or First Officer Farik guided the plane to the very limit of its range, or whether autopilot carried an unconscious cabin toward oblivion, remains the fracture line dividing investigators, families, and global analysts, because both scenarios carry chilling implications. Either a deliberate act executed with precision and emotional resolve, or a slow-motion catastrophe that left the aircraft drifting for hours, while everyone on board slipped into a hypoxic sleep from which no one ever awoke. But the final moments, the descent, are where the mystery becomes darkest. For satellite data suggests a rapid loss of altitude, a possible power outage, or a sudden aerodynamic drop that could indicate the engines flaming out. Yet debris evidence later suggested the possibility of a controlled ditching, something only a conscious pilot could perform. And those two contradictory narratives form the central paradox that has tormented investigators for over a decade. One set of data screams chaotic spiral, while another whispers smooth water landing, and both cannot be true at once. While the engines ran dry around 8:15 a.m., leading to the last handshake with Inmarsat, at 8:19 a.m., the aircraft may have glided many miles further, or it may have plunged instantly, and this ambiguity became the reason entire continents' worth of ocean floor were searched without success. For a spiraling descent would scatter the wreckage over a vast trench, while a controlled ditching could leave the fuselage mostly intact, sinking as a single heavy body to the bottom, where it would rest silently, shielded from sonar by underwater mountains and silt so thick it reflects no signals back to search vessels. Meanwhile, inside the cabin, a question no investigator can answer: were the passengers alive in those final moments? Were they unconscious from slow decompression that happened hours earlier? Or were they seated, strapped in, terrified and aware, experiencing the final descent into oblivion? If the cabin lost pressure early in the flight, hypoxia would have silently taken them within minutes. No panic, no pain, just a gradual slip into unconsciousness as oxygen drained from their blood. But if the event occurred later, if some mechanical failure or deliberate depressurization happened mid-flight, the horror becomes unimaginable. Hundreds of passengers enduring hours of cold darkness, thirst, fear, and the realization that no help was coming. Such possibilities are too painful for families to accept and too uncertain for officials to confirm, leaving MH370 suspended between tragedy and nightmare, one part science and one part horror. As the aircraft descended toward the Indian Ocean, the world below remained unaware that the most extensive aviation mystery in modern history was reaching its final chapter. Yet the ocean that awaited MH370 was not simply deep. It was impenetrable. The region, known as the Perth Basin, contains trenches deeper than Mount Everest is tall, canyons filled with undersea currents that scatter wreckage like sand in a storm, and underwater cliffs that distort sonar like fog distorts light. Conditions so challenging that even advanced autonomous underwater vehicles struggled to map the terrain. When search teams from Australia, China, Malaysia, and the US finally arrived months later, they realized they were attempting to find a single aircraft in an underwater landscape larger than entire nations, a world illuminated only by machines, not sunlight, where pressure would crush steel and silence swallows everything. As the sonar grids failed repeatedly, families asked the painful question, why did the aircraft not alert anyone? Why was there no emergency signal, no ELT beacon transmission, no automatic distress message from the aircraft systems? Investigators determined that the ELT activation required violent impact. Yet if MH370 entered the water smoothly, the ELT might never have triggered. And if the aircraft was intact for even minutes after landing, ocean pressure could have disabled it before transmission. The final hours of MH370 were also shadowed by geopolitical tensions, for nations near the suspected path remained unusually quiet about radar coverage, especially India, whose military radar on the Andaman and Nicobar Islands could likely detect a Boeing 777. Yet Indian officials insisted no such aircraft appeared, fueling suspicions that the flight path intersected sensitive military zones that nations preferred not to publicly acknowledge. Meanwhile, Thailand admitted late that weeks passed before it shared radar data, showing MH370 briefly re-entering their airspace, a delay that further inflamed accusations of cover-ups or embarrassment. These gaps in cooperation formed a fog of information that investigators could never fully pierce, and the truth drowned in diplomatic reluctance, leaving relatives of passengers to confront the unbearable uncertainty that their loved ones' final moments were being filtered through political secrecy. As the engines died, whether in a controlled glide or in a chaotic stall, MH370 entered a descent that changed the world. But the darkness that swallowed it was more than physical. It was informational. The aircraft's disappearance exposed the fragility of global aviation surveillance, revealing that vast scars of the planet remain unmonitored, where planes can vanish without a trace, where even modern communication systems possess vulnerabilities, where a rogue pilot or technical failure can erase hundreds of lives in silence, and where satellites, humanity's eyes in the sky, still struggle to decode faint signals from a single lost machine. And yet, the most haunting truth is this: MH370's final moments, whether peaceful or tortured, fast or slow, intentional or accidental, remain locked in a tomb 2 miles beneath the ocean surface, a place where light never reaches, where wreckage lays scattered or intact, where the final story rests in black boxes that continue to resist discovery, as if the ocean itself chose to guard the final secrets of Flight 370. This is the inescapable tragedy of MH370's final hours, a descent shrouded in uncertainty, 1,000 questions without answers, a cockpit whose last decisions are frozen forever in unreachable darkness, and a world left grasping for truth beneath layers of water, secrecy, and silence. A silence so vast that even after a decade, the disappearance of MH370 remains not only an aviation mystery, but a wound that time has failed to close. In the years after Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 vanished into the night sky and fell into the deepest silence known to the modern world, what began as a tragedy transformed into a living wound. A wound that spread through nations, tore apart families, divided investigators, and exposed the terrifying reality that even in an age of satellites, radars, global connectivity, and 21st-century surveillance, a 299-ton aircraft could simply disappear without answers, without closure, and without justice, leaving behind only drifting debris and broken hearts. And as the world demanded explanations, governments traded blame, aviation bodies rewrote safety rules, and families faced the unbearable truth that their loved ones had vanished into a void where technology failed. Diplomacy hesitated, and the human desire for answers collided with geopolitical secrecy. For the families of the 239 souls on board, the aftermath began not with grief, but with confusion. Hours after MH370 failed to land in Beijing, the relatives waited in bright airport halls under flickering screens, expecting each passing minute to reveal good news. A diversion, a technical glitch, a safe landing somewhere unexpected. Anything but the unthinkable. But instead of answers, they received scripted statements, contradictory updates, and vague reassurances that search operations are ongoing, a phrase repeated so often it became a knife twisting deeper into their hearts. As days became weeks, grief turned into a kind of burning fury, because the people responsible for finding their loved ones appeared more concerned with saving face than saving truth. Malaysian officials contradicted themselves publicly, announcing the plane turned back, then denying it, then admitting it days later. China released satellite images of supposed debris that turned out to be nothing. Vietnam claimed Malaysia delayed informing them of the aircraft's disappearance. And while nations bickered, the truth slipped further away. When Malaysia's Prime Minister appeared on television on March 24, 2014, and delivered the devastating line, MH370 ended in the southern Indian Ocean, families screamed, cried, collapsed, punched walls, fainted, clawed at the air, and some even refused to believe him, because he offered them a conclusion without evidence, an ending without wreckage, a story without bodies, and closure without truth. How could they believe that their husbands, wives, children, and parents were gone when not a single piece of the aircraft had been found? Many relatives felt betrayed, not only by the disappearance itself, but by the strange way the authorities handled the crisis. Why did Malaysia wait hours before activating search and rescue? Why did they release radar data in fragments? Why did they deny the plane turned back until foreign militaries forced them to acknowledge it? Why did they hide the pilot simulator data for months? Why did nations with powerful radars, including India, Australia, Thailand, and the US, remain silent about what they might have seen? And why did the world's most expensive search, covering an area the size of Greece, turn up nothing for years? As the official investigation grew more complex, families became investigators themselves, poring over radar maps, satellite pings, ocean drift studies, and leaked documents, forming support groups that eventually turned into global movements. Gatherings in Beijing, Kuala Lumpur, and Australia became protests, where loved ones held pictures of the missing and demanded transparency from officials who looked increasingly defensive each time a journalist asked, "What are you hiding?" The suspicion deepened when details emerged about the mysterious cargo on board, a shipment of lithium-ion batteries, initially denied and then quietly confirmed, raising questions about whether a fire might have played a role, though this alone could not explain the 7-hour flight path. Then came the revelation of the pilot simulator route, a programmed journey into the southern Indian Ocean, which Malaysian authorities had kept hidden until foreign investigators forced disclosure. The families were furious. Why hide anything unless you feared what people might conclude? Yet the more data emerged, the more fractured the narrative became. Some experts believed Captain Zahari had intentionally crashed the plane in a meticulously planned suicide. Yet there was no extremist ideology, no note, no history of depression, and no obvious motive. Others believed a catastrophic decompression had incapacitated everyone, allowing the plane to fly on autopilot until fuel exhaustion. Yet this could not explain the deliberate turning maneuvers. Still, others theorized hijacking. But no terrorist group claimed responsibility. No passenger had the skill to fly a Boeing 777, and no cockpit breach was detected. Each theory explained something, but none explained everything. As years passed and debris washed ashore on African coastlines and Indian Ocean islands, Réunion, Madagascar, Mozambique, Tanzania, the global public expected investigators to solve the mystery, but instead they received only vagueness, fragments that told partial stories, but never enough to reconstruct the truth. Barnacle growth patterns on the flaperon suggested it floated for months, but ocean drift models yielded too many possible origins. Burn marks on cabin debris raised questions about fire, but not enough evidence supported an onboard blaze. And the fact that the plane's final descent produced minimal floating debris suggested a controlled ditching. Yet the satellite Doppler readings suggested a chaotic plunge. Each clue contradicted another. MH370 had become not just a mystery, but a puzzle designed by fate to ensure no consistent explanation would ever stand unchallenged. Meanwhile, aviation agencies around the world began rewriting safety protocols. Aircraft now transmit more frequent position updates. Black box batteries were upgraded to send longer pings. Satellite tracking systems became more robust. Flight schools increased manual flying training. And even international treaties evolved to require continuous oceanic tracking of aircraft. These reforms were, in a sense, the only concrete legacy MH370 left behind. Changes born from loss, improvements paid for by grief. Yet for families, safety improvements were not closure. They were cold comfort. What they wanted was truth. What they needed was proof. What they demanded was answers. But year after year, governments repeated the same lines. We cannot determine the exact cause. The evidence is inconclusive. The wreckage location remains unknown. And slowly, families realized the truth that the world's officials would never say aloud. The ocean may keep MH370's secrets forever. Still, some relatives refuse to give up. They attend every anniversary vigil, write letters to aviation organizations, analyze every new theory, and pressure governments to reopen the search with new technology. Because for them, the disappearance is not simply a chapter in aviation history. It is a daily, suffocating void. Many have kept their loved ones' bedrooms intact for years. Clothes folded, toys untouched, photos preserved under glass, as if waiting for a miracle. Some parents of missing children still dream their child survived somehow and lives in a remote village, cared for by strangers. A fantasy born not of delusion, but of desperate love. Some spouses refuse remarriage, unable to move forward without a body. Some children grew up not knowing whether to grieve a vanished parent or hope for an impossible return. MH370 did not only take lives. It stole futures. It stole closure. It stole truth. And the world, with all its satellites, radars, submarines, and intelligence networks, could not give those families the one thing they needed most: an answer. But perhaps the most haunting part of MH370's aftermath is not the technical failure, not the unanswered questions, not the geopolitical silence, but the realization that we live in a world where it is still possible for a massive commercial aircraft to vanish into blue nothingness, leaving behind only speculation, fragments of metal, and grief suspended in time. MH370 exposed the blind spots of modern aviation, the parts of the sky where planes are not watched, the regions of the ocean where wreckage can hide in underwater mountains, the limitations of systems we believed were perfect. It reminded humanity that technology is not omnipotent, that governments conceal as much as they reveal, that truth can be drowned by secrecy and incompetence. MH370 became a symbol of everything humanity fears: uncertainty, disappearance, unanswered questions, and the terrifying possibility that some truths are simply unreachable. And so, MH370 remains, even today, a ghost flight, drifting eternally between fact and speculation, science and mystery, tragedy and myth. Its passengers remain frozen in time, neither alive nor properly mourned, existing only in memories and photographs held tight by families who deserve more than silence. The plane's final location remains a coordinate no one has found, a place where pressure crushes steel and darkness swallows everything, a tomb the ocean refuses to surrender. And until the wreckage is discovered, until the black boxes are raised from the abyss, until the final minutes are heard and understood, MH370 will continue to haunt aviation, to challenge investigators, to torment families, and to remind the world of a simple, devastating truth. Sometimes the sky keeps its secrets, and sometimes the ocean keeps them forever.